Hello. Today is Friday, December the 4th, and let's see, why is this day important? Today is important because, well, I mean, you can take your test on the life in the ancient regime this weekend. I'm not going to look at that test until Monday, so, if you don't take it today, that's fine, but yeah. And also, it's the end of our unit on the French Revolution. Who knows? We might be able to kill that guy Napoleon before the winter break. One of the side benefits of this stupid pandemic is that you know it does allow me to pick up my pace much better, and um, have I can actually have lectures cover territory on the same day that I give a test, which of course I could not do when we were in person, and I would rather be in person. I mean, I'm honest. Okay, I'll be honest with you guys. One thing, I don't know what your faces look like. If we do get to come back to school, and although I think we'll probably be wearing masks until the end of the year, I don't know what your faces look like. Except Miss Jasper, I know what her face looks like because I mean, and most of you, when you're on Google Meet, you have those little symbols, which is fine, which is fine. But I mean, but also more than that, I don't know you, and I don't get to see your reactions. If I say something that's almost funny, maybe some of you might have a reaction to it. So I don't know. It's just I'm looking at symbols, and that it does bother me. I actually, a part of me as a teacher feeds off of you know my audience, not you guys. I'm not Jerry Seinfeld or whatever, but it's still I perform to an audience, and an audience that I would like to see more of, but right now I can't do it. But anyway, and so we should finish this today, and we will try to. First thing we're going to talk about is art again, Mr. Horton, and the art that begins to emerge during the French Revolution is a movement that is called Romanticism. Now, once again, and Romanticism, which we'll talk about actually a whole lot in the next chapter, we need to breach into it today right now because it begins during the French Revolution. It is an art form that relies on several factors. One of those factors is emotion, appealing to the emotions. Remember that the Romantic movement is a backlash, a counter um, strike to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is all about logic. This equals that. Everything must add up mathematically. Where the Romantics say, no, no, it's human, it's emotional, it's the macabre, it's vengeance, it's, yes, love, but also so many things. And so, yeah. And we're also beginning with this piece of art that I'm going to pull up here. This piece of art is called The Death of Maurice. And this is very pertinent because this painting is a historical, depiction. But remember, it's a piece of art too. It's not a photograph. Um, let's talk about this guy. This guy's name is Jean-Paul Marat. Interesting character. Jean-Paul Marat was one of those guys who, he had several occupations during the course of his life. He was a doctor at one point in time. One point in time, he lived in the Parisian sewers, 2 years in the Parisian sewers, during which time he got a skin condition. a skin condition that the only way, and it was very painful skin condition. And the only way that he could soothe this skin condition, Jean-Paul Marat, and forgive me for saying this to our French teacher, Mr. Fasciato, Jean-Paul Marat became the only Frenchman in the world to take a bath every day. But no, I mean, there's actually an old, you know, an old Western, rather, and by that I mean Western Hemisphere joke about Frenchmen. They don't bathe, but I'm sure that's not true. But anyway, he had to. The only way that he could, keep this pain at bay was to have a soak in a bath. And he often, as you see in this painting, did his work in the bathtub. And his work by this time, after being a miscreant, after being a doctor, after living on the streets, he somehow finds a niche during the French Revolution, and he becomes a writer. He edits a paper called La Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people. And this paper always says the same thing. And what it says is that, the French Revolution is going good, but it would go much better if we were to root out and find all these counter-revolutionaries, these instigators, these troublemakers who, are working against us from within. And then he would compile a list. There'd be a list of real people he would accuse of being disloyal to France, of being disloyal to the revolution, of working, with France's enemies. And sure enough, whoever's on that list would end up going before the tribunals and being tried and being executed. And he just fed on itself. And then after they were executed, he would submit another list. People being executed. Well, when you do something like that, eventually you're going to make enemies. Eventually you're going to execute the wrong person. And so, turns out he caused the death of a friend of a woman. The woman's name was Charlotte Cordray. She was a woman from the provinces, which means out in the country. And she comes to Paris. Now, everyone knew Marat. He kept his door open, and regularly people came in to see him sitting in the bathtub to talk to him, have conversations with him. And Charlotte Cordray comes to his house, and she gets by the servants in the front gate, telling them she has a list of conspirators against the revolution that she wants to give to none other than Jean-Paul Marat. Well, aside from that list, well, she doesn't really have a list. She has in her blouse. Women back then wore corsets. And what are corsets? Corsets are kind of like a girdle. And the purpose of the girdle was to basically make the waist look thinner. And the garment was supported with what you call stays. And the stays were often made of whalebone. But one of the sleeves for the whalebone, Miss Corday had slipped what is called a stiletto, or a poignard. In French, it's called a poignard. And a stiletto is a knife that has only one purpose, not cutting, stabbing. Basically, it's just a point. And it's about that long, too. And so she walks in there, and, Jean-Paul Marat knows she has this list. And so Marat's like, Can I have the list, please? And instead, she reaches into her blouse, a peasant blouse with a hoop neck, reaches in, pulls out Mr. Stiletto, and just look here, right there. She sticks him one good time, and her stick she gets not lucky. She gets an artery and drops the poignard, which that's what that is right there, and stands there. She doesn't run, doesn't try to escape. She just stands there. And of course, he exsanguinates, which means he bleeds out. If you look, his bathtub is red, and he dies pretty much on the spot. And of course, the authorities rush in and they take her into custody. And at her trial, they ask, what did you hope to accomplish by killing Citizen Marat? And she said, I wanted to stop the violence. Didn't work. She herself later on got executed. All right, so now you know the story, but not the art. Now, the official painter, and you better have this down, he's on your test, the official painter of the French Revolution was a guy named Jacques-Louis David. Jacques, yes, Jacques Louis David, David. And he'll be one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of all the Romantic artists. He was the official painter of the French Revolution. During the Enlightenment period, he had also done what's the name of that painting? The Oath of the Herati. He did that as well, but that's nothing. This is his crowning achievement. And so Marat was the official painter of the Enlightenment. Jacques-Louis David was the official painter of the Enlightenment. And when Marat died, of course, the city of Paris was beside itself with grief. They had his funeral in Notre Dame, which will become the Temple of Reason, by the way. They convert Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason. Test question. They convert Notre Dame, the great cathedral, the one whose roof burned, to a church dedicated to deism called the Temple of Reason. And they had his funeral there. And on the altar, instead of his body, they had a bathtub, his bathtub, that one. And the city of Paris was beside itself. And Jacques-Louis David, the painter, wanted to portray the sympathy, the mercy. He wanted to emit the emotion that people should have over the death of Marat. And remember again, this is not a photograph. This is a painting. And so Jacques-Louis David could basically pose the guy any way he wanted to without even touching him, And so he poses him like this. And there is purpose in his madness. Now, hopefully, you recognize this piece of art. Yeah. And he wanted Marat to be looking. Notice his head slinked off to the side of the other way. But yeah, David wanted you to see Marat's face, but the posture is the same. That was not an accident. He wanted the people who looked at his painting to feel like, once again, who is this? Who is this? That my cursor is pointing. Who is this? This is, of course, the fallen Christ. What crime did Christ commit to be executed? He didn't. That's the thing. He committed no crime. He was totally innocent. and according to Christian theology, and according to the theology of most Frenchmen, that Christ died innocent. Well, Marat saying, David is saying, so did Marat, and so the poses are the same. Yeah, art imitates art. Art imitates art. Yeah. And this is a romantic piece. Don't let the black background fool you. This is a romantic piece of art. Later on, we will see another piece by Jacques Louis David entitled Napoleon Crosses the Alps. But that's a romantic painting as well. Yeah, David loved Napoleon. Loved him. Anyway, let's get back to the matter at hand, shall we? And here we are. So, we know that, Death of Maurice. So, the French Revolution actually caused the end of liberal reform movements in Europe. Once again, it is no coincidence that historians mark the end of the Age of Reason as 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution. The pendulum of reason, the pendulum of freedom, the pendulum of, hey, let's let all men are created equal, had swung too far. And then in the French Revolution, it just exploded. In 1792, the convention declared war on all powers who would oppose the revolution. I mean, so basically, think of this. In the French Revolution, it's a revolution. France is at war with France. But also during the revolution, France is at war with every other country in Europe. Every other country in Europe. So, in 1793, the Mountain, meaning the Jacobins, those guys who sat at the left, was in control of France and was at war with Austria, Britain, Prussia, Spain, Sardinia, and Holland, and actually were holding their own. What most remembers about the French Revolution, though, is the Reign of Terror. Now, the new fear in France was not foreign invasion, but rather CounterRevolution, opposition to the revolution. This resulted in a national mobilization called, test question, the Levée en Masse. And that meant that France was to focus all of its resources, all of its energies on the war effort, on the revolution. That required military requisition on the population. And you say, what does that mean, military requisition? It meant that the army began snatching up people's crops, snatching up their herds of cattle, pigs, sheep, things of that nature, forcing people into labor to do things for the military, conscripting males into the armies, and price ceilings. Price ceilings means shortages. A new group was formed to lead France, and it was called a Committee of General Security and a Committee of Public Safety was formed. Jacques Danton, who was the Minister of Justice, and Maximilien Robespierre were in charge of the committee. And these two couldn't have been more different. I mean, Danton was this ginormous guy, big, brawly, had a big, beefy voice. He was kind of like, if you ever watched Cheers, which I'm sure none of you have, Norm, where he walks in the bar and goes, Norm, and they buy him beer and stuff like that. He's a crowd favorite. Robespierre is tiny and intellectual, good speaker, great speaker, but really withdrawn, kind of. He feels uncomfortable with the crowd. I mean, as a child, Robespierre won a scholarship so he could go to school and get an education, a Latin education. And in fact, at one point in time, Robespierre, as a student, was honored by being allowed to recite a Latin translation of, I don't know, some document in front of Louis XVI. Robespierre would later be the man who sentenced him to his death. They were in charge of this Committee of Public Safety. Committee of Public Safety. Let's make sure we write that down. The Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety sounds like an organization whose primary role it is to help little kids cross the street. Pardon me. No, Committee of Public Safety, their job was to stamp out any resistance to the French Revolution within France, and to take extreme measures to do so. Now remember, French Revolution starts as being about freedom. All men are created equal. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, equality, fraternity. But this time, they're suppressing liberty, equality, fraternity to make everybody march in the same direction. Yes. To create this, as they called it, a republic of virtue, as they called it, in which everybody is in line with the ideas of the French Revolution. There were spies everywhere. There were tribunals going on all the time. People were being sentenced to death for charges like, for example, using the term Madame and Monsieur, which conveyed inequality, or complaining about standing in a line to get bread could get you taken before a tribunal, or not being enthusiastic about the war effort. Those kind of things could get you sent before a tribunal. Lazare Canard was in charge of the military. Roman numeral 22. Members of the committee wanted to create this thing called a republic of virtue, in which everything is in line with the ideas of the revolution. For example, naming streets after the egalitarian value of the revolution. You say, what does that mean? If you've ever been to France or seen pictures, most of the streets, which Mr. Leroy can tell you the word for street in French is rue, most of the streets are named after saints. Well, they changed the names of all the streets to represent equality, liberty, fraternity, labor, things of that nature. Suppression of plays that were insufficiently Republican, meaning any play that didn't support the French Revolution was shut down. And a general attack against crimes such as prostitution, which were closely related to an aristocratic society. Now, I will also mention that one of the things that the French Revolution does yeah, French Revolution freed slaves. Yes, French Revolution freed the slaves. And that's interesting. That's a good thing to remember. The French Revolution freed the slaves. And remember, in Haiti at this time, there was a population of several 100,000 slaves in Haiti producing sugar. French Revolution said, you're free. And I bring that up because when Napoleon takes over, Napoleon will say, we really need that money from sugar. So slaves, you're going to have to go back to work. I'm really sorry. Actually, it wasn't. Liberalizing divorce laws, it did that. But yeah, this movement did give women some more freedom. All right. In May of 1793, Pauline Léon and Claire Lacombe founded the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women. They were at first welcomed to the convention. They then demanded to dress like all the other attendees, to be able to wear the cockade, the red, white, and blue sash. But that was only worn by males. In October 1793, then the convention banned all women from the convention, from the assembly hall. Olympe de Gouges, who had written Declaration of the Rights of Woman, also then criticized and opposed the Reign of Terror. She, in turn, for her trouble, tried and guillotined. The idea of excluding women was in keeping with the Jacobin idea of men being active citizens and women being the domestic help in the government. Yeah. The convention also tried to de-Christianize France with its policies, such as, remember that the French Revolution is supposed to be a function, a result of the Enlightenment. And they wanted to create France as this government, this society of the Enlightenment. And so one of the things they did was to do away with the calendar. Remember that the calendar that you use and I use today is the same calendar they got rid of. What is wrong with the calendar that you and I use today? Well, what is today? Today is December the 4th, 2020. What does the 2020 mean? 2020 years since what? What does AD mean? And please don't say after death. Its Latin stands for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. 2020 refers to 2020 years since the birth of Christ. Well, that had to go. Why? Because the birth of Christ, which may well have happened, was illogical. You say, what's illogical about it? Remember, Christ's mother was a virgin. Then they also did away with the names of all the months, because in the old calendar, all the months were based upon cycles of the moon, contained religious holidays, and the new calendar began the year one as 1792, which was the adoption of the new 1791, the adoption of the new calendar. That was the year one. The calendar had 12 months, 30 days, named for season and climate. Pardon me, I'm going to sneeze. 12 months of 30 days. Weeks. The old 7-day weeks were thrown away. Why did they throw away 7-day weeks? Forgive me again. What's wrong with a 7-day week? Answer, where does 7 days come from? That's an odd number. Where does 7 days come from? 7 days, if you've read your Genesis, is the amount of time it took God to create the earth, and that's why we have 7-day weeks. Of course, the thinkers of the Enlightenment and the leadership of the French Revolution said that's illogical, and so they chose 10-day weeks. Why 10? It's metric. 3 weeks of 10 days, 12 months of 30 days. That leaves 5 days left over, right? What do you do with them? They became holidays, like one to celebrate liberty, one to celebrate fraternity, one for equality. I don't know what the other two were, but yeah. So there's your calendar, your new calendar. And they changed the names, like, for example, July became Thermidor because it was warm. April became Bon Temps. So that changed the name of all the months to reflect ideas of science. So Notre Dame became the Temple of Reason. The old Notre Dame, the oldest church there, became known as the Temple of Reason. A temple which, by the way, Robespierre himself conducted worship services in. By closing churches, by persecuting clergy, and by forcing priests to marry, the convention roused some staunch opposition. See, this was probably one of their greatest mistakes, because, the thinkers of the French Revolution, the leadership of the French Revolution, thought they could just change France, that on a dime they could make people change the way they thought. Remember that so many of 80% of the population were peasants. They were all staunchly Roman Catholic. and you're going to tell them on a dime, okay, now you're not Roman Catholic, and all your ancestors who worship God, worshiped in the Roman Catholic Church for well over a millennium, they were all boneheads. Can't hardly do that. And did arouse some staunch opposition. Robespierre, Maximilien de Robespierre, the little shrimp, was the fire of the terror. He was staunchly Republican. He was selfless and actually had some interesting, virtuous. For example, in the beginning of the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre was against the death penalty. But as the revolution goes on, he'll be the one signing people's death warrants. Lots of people's death warrants. He opposed the 1792 war and also felt de-Christianization was a blunder. Now, the Reign of Terror, as it was called, and the Reign of Terror lasts from approximately, it's 11 months. It lasts from like July of 1792 to June of 1793. And yeah, and every day in Paris, it was the same thing. You have a procession of people loaded in the back of a cart, and you have the mob on the street throwing stuff at them, and the people get led up to the guillotine, and then they're tied down, and then they're executed. And the next day, the same thing happens all over again. It happens so many times that, they have to keep moving the guillotine from place to place around the Plaza de la Revolution because it's a mess. You know what I'm saying? I mean, each body holds a certain was it 6 pints of blood? 8? 6? I think it's 6. And, when you cut somebody's head off, it loses a lot of that. And it spills out, makes a mess, tracks flies, dogs. And yeah, it's a mess. So, 11 months, 25,000 people died in those executions. And here's the thing. At first, the people who were executed were obvious enemies of the revolution. They were the royalists. But eventually, they start running out of royalists, actually. The royalists escape, they get out of town. But they wanted to keep the fire of the revolution going by, going out and showing that they're aggressive, by going out and finding other victims. And so at first it was enemies of the revolution, and then it was people who were opposed to the revolution, and then it was people who were ambivalent about the revolution, and then it was people who were not enthusiastic enough about the revolution. And finally, before the end of it, you begin seeing people being executed who were just political enemies of each other. For example, Robespierre had his former friend, Danton, executed because he disagreed with him. And, it just spiraled into madness. As it says that, the first victim of the Reign of Terror was Marie Antoinette, along with other members of the royal family. By the way, the Dauphin, Dauphin, the Dauphin died in prison. And I'm sure you're all saying, wait a minute, what is a fish, or rather a swimming mammal, doing in a prison? Well, hopefully, you know that the Dauphin is the oldest son of Louis XVI. The Dauphin is Louis XVII, who was a child. He was in prison with the rest of the royal family, and since he was the heir to the throne, his treatment was actually worse than most other people. And because of abuse, he died as a child in prison. But Marie Antoinette, quite interesting. Pardon me. So Marie Antoinette is sentenced to die. They have her trial. they have her trial. She's accused of a whole litany of things: spending too much money, treason, giving information to Austria, and wait for it, incest. She was accused of having sex with her own children. And they brought her in there. And by the way, she wasn't wearing any of her nice stuff. Like Louis XVI came in there, he was wearing silks and things like that. She was basically dressed in the clothing of a maid. And Marie Antoinette, by this time, she was just in her 30s. And her hair, which had been blonde, was completely white. I mean, because of course stress, obviously. And she was emaciated. I mean, she was a shadow of what she had been, obviously. And so they bring her in there and they rail all these charges against her. And when they get to the incest part, she jumps up and she screams, and this is the queen still, at these people. How could you ever say such a thing about me? And for a while, there was actually kind of a mumbling that perhaps they might just let her go because, she had seen too much, been through too much. But then Jacobins took over, and sure enough, she was then sentenced to death. So she got ready, said goodbye to the children. She sat in the execution room. She had her hair cut, which is what they did. You couldn't the hair might get in the way of the guillotine, dull the blade or whatever, and not make a clean cut. And so she had her hair pretty much all cut off. The next morning, she's going to the street, and when she sees that instead of the royal carriage like her husband got, they just have the open cart. It's an open cart. She almost faints, because she knows what's ahead for her. So they load her onto the cart, and sure enough, she goes down the street, and of course, people just assault her. They just throw stuff, call her names, spit. And see, to me, this is the miracle part of the whole thing. So, a mile journey, that being done to her, and they finally get her to the platform where the guillotine is. They take her upstairs, and Marie Antoinette, first of all, is a tiny, tiny woman. And now she's an emaciated, that means thin, tiny, tiny woman. And she steps forward to be tied up. And as she steps forward, she steps on the foot of the man who is going to execute her. I mean, the guy's wearing all black, hooded over his face. And as she steps on his foot, she says, "I am sorry, monsieur. I assure you it was not on purpose." She apologizes to the guy. See, that amazes me. I mean, here she is, she's about to be executed. She's just been assaulted by all these strangers. And, she got accused of incest yesterday. And she still has the dignity, the wherewithal, the the queen-like quality to ask for this man's forgiveness, who's about to cut her head off, by the way. It's just interesting. So, eventually, yeah. So she starts the Reign of Terror. Girondins, who were too moderate, were next. Thousands of people were executed as the terror moved out into the outer provinces. Eventually, the terror consumed more and more and a greater variety of people, many of whom just caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Robespierre began to execute more people who were now just political enemies, not enemies of the revolution. He executed enrages who had wanted further regulation of prices, social equality, and dechristianization. He killed his former friend Danton, whose last words were, "My only regret is that I get to go before that rat Robespierre." So in May of 1794, at the height of Robespierre's power, he did away with reason, idea, and substituted the cult of the supreme being. Robespierre made an angry speech, and see that he makes a mistake. He gets up in the middle of the assembly and makes this angry speech to the assembly, trying to rouse their emotions to back him. And he says, right here, I have a list right here of conspirators, of traitors that I'm going to announce. And people in the assembly had been disappearing right and left, had been being executed. And he says, I got this list. And then he doesn't read any names off of it and walks off the stage, finishes his speech. Well, all the people are saying, who's this going to be? And so they decide to take matters in their own hands. They, in turn, the next day, when he stands up to speech, they not only shout him down, but they arrest him, try him right there for treason or whatever, and they condemn him to death. Now, during the night, Robespierre is locked upstairs where the king was in his chamber, so he doesn't go anywhere. Pardon me. And during the night, the guards hear a gunshot. Two, actually. The guards run into the room. They found one of Robespierre's companions lying on the floor, dead. Robespierre himself is also lying on the floor. Robespierre had attempted to shoot himself, only he missed. Well, he didn't fully miss. He shot himself in the jaw. He literally tore his jaw off with the mini ball. But he was still alive. And see, that's the ironic thing. He was still alive, only his greatest strength was the fact that he could speak, but not anymore. And he could only moan and in agony while he awaited his own beheading. By the end of the Reign of Terror claimed some more than 25,000 victims. Although the largest number of these victims had been peasants and the sans-culottes, the working class who had rebelled against the revolutionary movement. The Thermidorian reaction, so, Robespierre's death ends the revolution. Robespierre's death ends the Reign of Terror. That's it. Robespierre's death ends the Reign of Terror. But it's not over. The revolution's not over. The Thermidorian reaction, that means it happens in July. And reaction means it's a backlash against liberalism. Reaction, remember? Reaction. Reactionaries, extreme conservatives, which entailed the destruction of the terror and institution of a new constitution began July 1794. And what happened was, these people who had for so long been in hiding, they came out of hiding and they were going to take their vengeance. The terror moderated in its ferocity as it just burned itself out. I mean, the simple thing is you cannot build something positive on something negative. You can't build a country if all you've got is just saying negative things about other people. You can't build a society that way. You can't build something in fire. Eventually, the fire burns out. The rest of the committee was executed. The Paris Jacobin Club was closed. And then came what is called the White Terror. In the White Terror, many of those same old radicals who had been going around killing people and trying them were themselves attacked, murdered, often with no due process. Organizations who basically either priests or supporters of priests, refractory priests, people who supported the Roman Catholic Church, who were called Bands of Jesus, often dragged the cult of the Supreme Being, from prison and murdered them. Plays that condemned the revolution, parties that glorified surviving the revolution. For example, it became fashionable for the first time for women to wear a red sash around their neck, really tight, that indicated a line that would have, the blade would have passed through, meaning they survived. A choker, yeah. Some women had that line tattooed in their neck. So, glorified surviving the revolution, refractory priest returned to the country, and there was a genuine return for Catholicism. plus the repeal of liberal divorce laws for women. However, the French did not bring back slavery. Napoleon will do that, but not yet. In general, French women assumed a less free position after the Revolution. And the last form of government of the French Revolution is this organization called the Directory. The Directory, which consisted of a two-house legislature and a council of directors, 5 people, now rule the country. Thermidor, or Thermidorian reaction, has become to be associated with political reactionaryism. Don't you love that word? The French Revolution has often been considered the victory of the bourgeoisie. Fact of the matter was, the nobility were thrown out of power and was replaced by the bourgeoisie, the money class. The largest new property class to emerge from the revolution was the peasantry. I mean, that's another thing that the French Revolution does do. The peasants received the land they'd been working on, their families been working on for generations, for millennia. Yeah, the peasants got to own their own land, the land they worked. The peasants, however, did not have to pay for their land, which is what will happen in Russia. Later on, when the serfs are freed there, the Russian government will make them pay for their land. The Thermidorians repealed price controls on food. That resulted in some of the highest food prices in winter, and the winter of 1774-1795 was another brutal winter that really made survival hard. There were food riots that had to be put down by force. On October the 5th, 1793, 13th of Vendemiaire, which is a section of Paris, the royalist section of Paris, rose up against the convention. You see, what happened was the Directory had held new elections. Okay? So the Directory in 1793 holds these new elections. The problem was that all the people who were elected were royalists. And so the Directory says that vote didn't count. Why does that sound familiar? Says that vote didn't count. We're going to have new elections. And because of that, all the royalist sections of Paris rose up against the convention, and the Directory brings in this new guy I haven't mentioned yet, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had very young still, had risen from the ranks of being a second lieutenant in the French artillery to being an officer to being second lieutenant's an officer, but he rose up in rank and was given credit for his great ability. He was brought in to put down the rioting. And what he did, very clever, he disperses the crowd with a whiff of grape shot. You say, what does that mean? Well, grape shot is a type of ammunition they would put in cannon. It's not an exploding cannonball, but grape shot is simply, it's like a bag of balls, kind of like buckshot in a shotgun. And what happened was, a whiff of grape shot means that he fired close to the crowd. Yeah, he didn't want to kill lots of people, but he wanted the crowd to run, which they did. In Paris, Gracchus Babur led a conspiracy of equals who called for a more radical democracy and for more equality of property. He also was arrested, tried, and executed. The Directory now was dependent upon the power of the army, meaning Bonaparte, rather than constitutional processes to rule the country. In the end, make sure you make note of this, the French Revolution began with an absolute monarch. It will end with an absolute monarch, that being Napoleon. N'est-ce pas? Verstehen Sie das? Begin with an absolute monarch, that's Louis XVI, and it ends with another. So, with that being said, I'm going to shut down, and I will see you all. Well, that finishes our chapter, and we'll start a new unit next week.